I'd like to start by congratulating Father Luigi on arranging this wonderful series of lectures for the Bicentennial. Like Bishop Franklin, my aim today is to deepen our knowledge of an aspect of St. Thomas that you may know to a degree, but which deserves a deeper dive. Specifically, I'm going to focus on the role women have played in nurturing the well-being of this parish, both financially and in their commitment to a Christian mission of service. At St. Thomas, the first woman vestry member was welcomed in 1973, just after the arrival of John Andrew as our new rector, who, as we learned from Bishop Franklin 2 weeks ago, was exceptionally forward-looking and sensitive to the societal changes in New York City and the country at large. Though in fairness, I should note that the vestry had resolved to allow women to serve on the vestry back in December of 1969, 2 years before John Andrew's arrival. Her name was Anne Exline, and she served on the vestry for 5 years and then as warden from 1981 to 1990. Then it wasn't until 2015 that women ministers would regularly officiate at our services. So it would be very easy to think that women had little to do with the governance, financial well-being, and general health of the parish. But that would be so wrong, and that's what I'm here to clarify today. So let's back up all the way to the 1830s, when the parish was young and situated on the corner of Broadway and Houston Streets, immortalized here in this painting by George Harvey that's in our Bicentennial exhibition, and that captures the ambiance of New York at the time. Bustling, growing, commercial, and energized. It was at this time that the third rector, Francis Lister Hawkes, placed particular emphasis on the Sunday school, and in doing so, he succeeded in creating what the vestry rather immodestly recorded as, quote, one of the largest and best arranged Sunday schools ever collected in a church in this city, unquote. By 1833, the numbers were so great that the Sunday school held its sessions at a public school on Worcester Street, and by 1836, 1,400 children and 80 teachers, virtually all of them women, flocked there on a weekly basis, where they enjoyed the resources of a library consisting of an astonishing 3,000 volumes. Significantly, at least I think so, there were in addition 80 pupils in the school the parish established for children of African descent. Now, I can't give you the names of the women of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s who contributed to the good works of the parish, but that should come as no surprise, because this was an era when records for the activities of women routinely lay beneath the records of their fathers, husbands, or brothers, and this could be true of even the wealthiest women of the city. You'll notice throughout my illustrations that the Christian names of the women committee members of the parish are nowhere to be seen, as they continue to be listed under their husbands' names, Mrs. Frederick, Mrs. William, Mrs. Charles, etc. Let's look, for example, at Mrs. Marshall O. Roberts, wife of a railroad and steamship magnate, art collector, and philanthropist, and herself a glowing example of women's charitable work in her time. Thanks to Wikipedia, which has a more gender-neutral view of lineage than was prevalent in the mid-19th century, I learned that her name was Caroline Danforth Smith, and that she came from a very liberal, progressive family in Hartford, Connecticut. Her elder sister Mary was married to the abolitionist William Weston Patton, who became the 5th president of Howard University, while Caroline herself was a friend of President Lincoln and founded several, at a minimum 4, benevolent societies in New York City. These included the Ladies' Christian Union, established in 1858, to house, quote, young ladies who are supporting themselves by their own exertions, unquote. That would be entirely wholesome exertions, I should emphasize. The precursor of the YWCA, the Ladies' Christian Union charged $3 per week for room and board at a time when the highest wage women could aspire to was $6 a week, and department stores paid saleswomen $2 per week for 12-hour days. With the entrepreneurial acumen typical of affluent women of the period, In 1868, Caroline Roberts and her society purchased a home at Washington Square to lodge the young women, soliciting $50,000 in donations from men who included both the old and new rich of New York, Knickerbockers like Peter Cooper, founder of Cooper Union, Frederick DePeyster, first president of the New York Historical Society, and Theodore Roosevelt Sr., as well as nouveau riche magnates, including Cornelius Vanderbilt and department store magnate Alexander T. Stewart. Their wives also made significant contributions: Mrs. John D. Rockefeller, Mrs. William Henry Vanderbilt, and Mrs. Samuel Morse among them. Many of these donors were St. Thomas parishioners, and thus we can appreciate how, in the mix, our parishioners were around 1868. Although, so far as I can tell, Caroline and Marshall Roberts were not parishioners of St. Thomas. Our church was then still located downtown, and their residence was at 18th Street and Fifth Avenue, where their preferred church was Calvary at Park Avenue and 21st Street. Nevertheless, Caroline Roberts exemplifies how women of mid-19th century New York cared for the indigent and encouraged the advancement of education and service among the female population. This established a model that would take hold and be expanded during the coming decades, not only at St. Thomas, but at other churches throughout the city. Parenthetically, I might add that during the 21st century, the LCU, as it is now called, had strong ties to St. Thomas, with Hope Preminger as its chair, yours truly as a member of the board, and Bishop Sisk's wife Karen, an active board member as well. Naturally, for this lecture, I wanted to establish whether St. Thomas Parish was unique in the roles that were initiated by and assigned to women during the last decades of the 19th century and early years of the 20th century. What I found was that the answer is both yes and no. After all, this was an era when government assistance was all but non-existent, so it fell to churches and benevolent societies to care for the needy. At the same time, it was a period of enormous wealth, so the ability to give and to care was most certainly there, the wealth gap being rather comparable to our societal situation today. Put simply, the men focused their energies on making the money, and the women were expected to devote theirs to spending it, not always on themselves, but rather on pursuing respectable and necessary avenues for the distribution of that wealth. As the influx of immigrants arriving in the city was ever on the rise during the last years of the 19th century, well-established parishes, such as Trinity Wall Street, Grace Church, and St. Thomas, established free chapels. These houses of worship were located in the midst of the tenement houses the immigrants lived in, and offered more than just religious services and counseling. Unlike the parish churches themselves that were attended by pew holders who donated generously to the mother churches, the free chapels were just that, free, and they catered to the poor both to nourish them spiritually and to bring them into the Christian community. St. Thomas's first free chapel was located at the corner of Prince and Thompson Street and came into being as a result of a 5-month-long survey conducted by the rector William Ferdinand Morgan with his newly appointed vicar Ralph Hoyt. That survey analyzed the needs of the local poor and how to address those needs. St. Thomas historian Robert Wright quoted Hoyt's assessment of the neighborhood as, quote, revealing a long succession of such mournful pictures of debased and suffering humanity as might well make angels weep and Christians tremble under the sense of their responsibility, unquote. And then Wright himself continued, quote, through the aid of Dr. Morgan and the women of the parish, Mr. Hoyt was able to dispense food and medicine so that at least a few families were saved from utter destitution and despair, a few children rescued from the paths of ruin. As a result, in 1858, the rector established a free mission chapel, tasked with serving the poor and supported by 4 collections per year to pay for the expenses. The chapel was a resounding success, and Vicar Hoyt observed in his first annual report that, quote, every shade of New York life and character is represented at the service of St. Thomas's Chapel, from persons of the highest respectability, education, and refinement, down to those whom ignorance, poverty, and dissipation have driven beyond all hope, unquote. He really didn't hold back. And in that same report, his item number 4 singled out, quote, the labors and liberality of ladies of St. Thomas's Church in devoting much time and expense in preparing garments for the destitute, by which means a large number of persons have been comfortably clad and enabled to attend the chapel services during the inclement seasons of the year. This diligent exertion has been unmentioned by themselves, but the results have gladdened many a sad heart, and they entitle the, quote, Ladies' Society to our sincerest thanks and highest commendation, unquote. So from this, we can conclude that the women of St. Thomas Parish were very active in serving the community, even before the church moved uptown to our present location on 53rd Street. And in that way, we can appreciate that St. Thomas was in the forefront of women being proactive in parish life. So now let's take a look at how the activities of St. Thomas's women fit into the larger Episcopal Church landscape of the 19th century in New York, focusing first on all the goings-on during the 1870s. By the early 1870s, Grace Chapel was offering daycare and teaching employment skills as well as recreation, all in accordance with the teachings of Henry Codman Potter's social gospel. Potter had become rector at Grace in 1868 and was destined to become the bishop of the Diocese of New York and ultimately bishop of the United States. A side note, but surely an important one, is that Potter's calling to Grace came immediately after our St. Thomas rector, Dr. Morgan, had spent 2 years, 1866 and 1867, as the rector of the combined congregations of Grace and the then homeless St. Thomas, while our third church was under construction on 53rd Street. Grace was without a rector, and we were without a building, so the two parishes found the perfect solution and common cause. Potter's role while at Grace Church from 1868 to 1875 was pivotal, and it seems clear that our St. Thomas community very much moved in lockstep with his views. For example, in October 1875, Potter brought to his parish Sister Louise, a member of the Sisterhood of the Holy Communion, to serve in the role of parish visitor at Grace Chapel. She then set up the St. Catherine's Guild for 17 working women with families, who in turn cared for the sick and taught sewing and reading and Bible classes. Also under Potter, Grace Memorial House with its nursery was established, and Grace Chapel was rebuilt with expanded programming that offered instruction in English as well as services in German. Of course, we have to remember that the largest number of immigrants at the time were Germans. In institutionalizing care for the poor immigrants, St. Thomas was even ahead of the curve because Mrs. Morgan, the wife of the rector, had established the Ladies' Employment Society in 1872, 3 years before Sister Louise had arrived at Grace. And then in 1876, this society morphed into the Industrial School, organized by Mrs. Annie Rutherford Dahlgren, and the Society for the Industrious Poor, whose bylaws had been approved the year before in 1875. The Industrial School met weekly to teach poor young girls to sew and guide them to become self-supporting, most likely in the garment industry, while both spiritual and material attention to the needs of the young mothers came from the parish's Helping Hand Association, established in 1879. Virtually all of these activities were associated with the Free Chapel, and until one looks into the specifics, one might have assumed that the chapel's body of governors would have looked something like this: all men, when in fact we now know this was anything but the case, even though there are no photos of the ladies' committees, unfortunately. Like Grace Church, St. Thomas appointed a parish visitor for the chapel in 1878, a lay woman named Lisa Lovell, who was charged with outreach to the community to promote the activities of the chapel and coordinate that outreach with the vicar Robert C. Lowry. Under Morgan's successor as rector, John Wesley Brown, the roles women of the parish played continued to flourish, with regard both to service and to their benevolent donations. As our parish historian Robert Wright recorded, quote, "Within 6 months of Dr. Brown's tenure, the vestry approved his recommendation to employ for parish work a woman named Sister Julia, whose identity has not been established with certainty and who may have been a deaconess or possibly a member of a women's religious order. Initially, her compensation was $50 a month, but in 1891, this was increased to $1,000 per year. Brown's rectorship saw generous financial benefactions from women of the parish, both as groups and as individuals. Most notable were the 1893 donation from Grace Scoville for the purchase of 60 acres in Long Island for a summer home for children, and Emma Gertrude Halsey's 1897 donation of funds for the building of a state-of-the-art facility for daycare. The Halsey Day Nursery, which cared for children of working mothers throughout the year, contained a laundry facility, kitchen and children's dining room, roof garden, rooms for kindergartners, and hammocks for the little ones. This was all staffed by just 3 nurses, a matron, cook, and laundress, at a cost of 15 cents per day, of which mothers who were able contributed 1/3, and the board of managers made up the balance. Mrs. Halsey continued to contribute to the operations of the day nursery until her death in 1908, for example, providing 517 pounds of poultry one year and 563 pounds of turkey the next year for the family's Thanksgiving feasts. The nursery and summer home continued to flourish under Brown's successor, the Reverend Ernest Stiers, who made clear with characteristic eloquence his uncompromising commitment to serve those less fortunate among us. In his words, which I'm condensing here, quote, "The mission of St. Thomas is to the well-to-do for their own sake and for the sake of those who are not well-to-do. Many suffer from having too little and many from having too much. All must suffer until relief is given. The mission of St. Thomas is to help us save ourselves by saving others. Our hearts and hands must be quick to aid the suffering everywhere, to help God's cause, for the needs were never so great." Unquote. True to his word, Stiers' tenure as rector saw the work of the Society for the Industrious Poor expand under the guidance of a large committee of women parishioners, such that the nursery attendance was 8,168 in 1905 and 11,114 in 1906, while during the summer months, the younger children were taken to frolic in the park 3 times a week, and the older ones enjoyed a month at the summer home. In his rector's preface to the yearbook, Stiers commented, quote, "Our fresh air work at the summer home deserves particular attention. More children were received and cared for than ever before, and in spite of the fact that many live in crowded tenements and a large number cannot be physically strong under the conditions in which they live, not a single doctor's visit was necessary during the whole summer, nor was a dollar spent for medicines, a health record which will successfully invite comparison." Unquote. The Sunday school also flourished, with 230 children in attendance in 1906. And as an aside, I find this all the more remarkable when I consider that these were the very years of the disastrous fire that destroyed the Third Church. Debris had to be cleared, and parishioners worshipped for years in the temporary structure constructed on the ruins. And yet the beat went on, and parish work continued uninterrupted. During these years, Stiers also beefed up the missionary work that served various ethnic groups and nationalities and was administered by the Women's Auxiliary of St. Thomas Church, which Stiers established at the parish in 1901. As described in the 1905 and other yearbooks, and again I'm condensing, the Women's Auxiliary of St. Thomas's Church is part of the whole organization created in 1871 by the Board of Missions in session in Baltimore, with the object of aiding the work of the board by contributing money for the support of missionaries, for the building of chapels at mission stations, and for educational and kindred purposes, and also by sending boxes of clothing and other necessaries to missionaries whose stipends are insufficient for their support and whose distance from sources of supply renders it difficult and expensive for them to satisfy their own needs, unquote. The St. Thomas's branch of the Women's Auxiliary met monthly, and every woman in the parish was invited to attend as often as convenient. More specifically, the auxiliary's secretary reported that in just 1 year, quote, Bishop McKim told us of our opportunities in Japan, Dr. Mary V. Glenton of the hospital work in China, Archdeacon Houston of the ever-interesting Southern problem, and Mr. Wood gave a brief survey of the mission field. 14 missionary boxes have been sent during the year, valued at $749, and 10 scholarships have been maintained, unquote. Thus, the committees, consisting entirely of women of the parish, focused on Indian, read that as Native American, Mexican, and other foreign missions, and they met, deliberated, and made distributions on behalf of the parish. In 1905, with contributions to the general work from 29 ladies amounting to $2,354.59, they dispersed varying amounts to fund 27 scholarships and other sources of support, such as building funds and salaries. These included the William F. Morgan Medical Scholarship at St. John's College in Shanghai, Dr. Glenton Wuchang China Building Fund and the Women's Hospital, St. Thomas's Scholarship at St. Margaret's School in Tokyo, a teacher's salary in Cape Mount, Africa, the Hooker Orphanage in Mexico, a clergyman's insurance fund, and various scholarships in Dallas, Texas, South Dakota, New Mexico, Wyoming, Virginia, and Tennessee. The Foreign Committee received $377, the Indian Committee $210, the Mexican Committee $133, and the largest sum went to missions to colored people at $340. Stiers further institutionalized the importance of serving women with women by appointing the first deaconess for the parish in 1904. By 1905, there were 3 deaconesses, Miss Adwin, Miss Palmer, and Miss Crosby, who also doubled as the parish nurse. Moreover, Stiers garnered financial support to house the deaconesses in immediate proximity to the chapel and the people it served. Stiers wrote in the 1905 yearbook, quote, "You will note cause for satisfaction in the annual statement of our mission work at St. Thomas's Chapel, with its interesting group of buildings. It is a more important factor than ever in the life of the Great East Side. A new building has recently been added to our equipment, purchased with money left by the late Miss Evelina Dortick, to be dispersed by her sister for some good purpose. The sister, Miss Adela Dortick, realizing the value of our mission work, felt the wisdom of providing a home for our deaconesses or similar workers. This property, number 226 East 60th Street, adjoins the chapel on the west and will be a house of sympathy and help for the distressed women of the East Side, a veritable city of refuge for young girls who can go to our kindly deaconesses for counsel and comfort. For the purchase, repair, and maintenance of this building, the sum of $30,000 was placed in the hands of the rector. The parish expresses its sincere appreciation of Miss Dortick's decision in thus discharging her sacred trust and honoring the memory of a devoted sister," unquote. Later in Stiers' tenure as rector, as St. Thomas celebrated its centennial, several women of the parish made significant donations of works of art. Mrs. Lewis Bennett's gift of the Flemish tapestry today hangs in the balcony above the narthex, with a border signaling the intention of the gift in memory of her son, who had been confirmed at St. Thomas in 1907 and was killed in action in 1918. In 1924, pew holder Marjorie Merriweather Post, Mrs. E.F. Hutton at the time, gave the church the Adoration of the Magi painting attributed to the School of Rubens that hangs above the stairs at the south end of the narthex. And further gifts by women parishioners followed during the 1920s, many with an eye to the arts in the service of faith, to borrow the title of our bicentennial exhibition. These included embellishments of the Chantry Chapel's windows and furnishings donated by Mrs. Hamilton McCown Twomley and her daughters, the 21 bells in the tower given by Mrs. George Arentz and her children, and the clerestory windows given by Mrs. William Burden and her sons. After Ernest Stiers moved on to become Bishop of Long Island, work of the various women's organizations continued, but as the neighborhood of the East Side changed and the needs of the poor changed as well, especially during the Great Depression, when it was not only immigrants who were in desperate straits, the parish adapted. The summer house was sold, and other arrangements were made to avail the poor of country air at the new St. Thomas camp at Lake Kanawaki near Tuxedo. During and immediately after World War II, the chapel became increasingly independent as its own parishioners contributed increasingly to its operations and governance, and the Halsey Day Nursery closed in 1946. But during the 50s and 60s, the rector Frederick Myers Morris recognized that there were still many possibilities for women to contribute as they put together Bundles for America and worked for the St. Luke's Hospital Social Service, among other projects. Asserting the need, in his words, quote, to mobilize the women power of St. Thomas Church, unquote, Morris recognized all the components of the women's auxiliary. The Altar Guild Service Club, United Thank Offering, and Church Periodical Club under a new name, the Women of St. Thomas Church, with Mrs. Herbert E. Twyford as president. Within a year, the group met with sufficient success to justify hiring a full-time executive secretary, Mrs. Kenyon Young, to coordinate its many projects. As I mentioned at the top of my lecture, the early 70s marked the moment when women began to serve as equal partners to the men in the lay governance of the parish, with Anne Exline being elected to the Vestry in 1972. That women had at last arrived for the Episcopal Church as a whole was also clear even a year earlier, when a St. Thomas parishioner, Julia P. Sibley, was one of 2 women ordained deacon in the Diocese of New York to serve as a chaplain in the East Midtown hospitals. Our church exterior also reflected the changing times of the early 70s, when the African-American educator Mary McLeod Bethune was immortalized in the statuary of the Tower, along with newly carved sculptures of Martin Luther King Jr., Abraham Lincoln, and William Wilberforce, in celebration of the ideal of liberation. And so we come back to the beginning, with Anne Exline serving as vestrywoman and warden. That level of equality in service and governance then continued throughout the tenures of John Andrew and Andrew Mead, as it does today with Carl Turner, the proof positive being in the extraordinary service Casey Metzger Harvey has dedicated to this parish for so many years on the vestry as just the 4th woman warden and as treasurer. And I thank Casey for her service and all of those women, and I thank you for your attention.